Today we have with us Dr. Michael Hankins. He's the curator of Air Force, Navy, and Marine Corps post-World War II aviation at the Smithsonian National and Air and Space Museum. He's also the author of Flying Camelot, the F-15, the F-16, and the Weaponization of Fighter Pilot Nostalgia. He's also the former professor of strategy at the United States Air Force Air Command and Staff College, and former instructor of military history at the U.S. Air Force Academy in Colorado Springs. He earned his PhD in history from Kansas State University in 2018 and his master's in history from the University of North Texas in 2013. Dr. Hankins, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's really great to be here.
The platform's all yours, sir. We're really interested in listening to you talk about your book. So I'll just turn it right over to you.
Well, fantastic. I appreciate it. And before I get started, I feel like I should say happy birthday to the Air Force, because today is the 75th anniversary of the creation of the U.S. Air Force. So maybe we should call it its Independence Day rather than its birthday. I don't know. You know, want to acknowledge that heritage we're taking part in today. And we're going to talk about two Air Force aircraft today. Let me pull up my slides while I kind of start this so I can show you some pictures of what we'll be talking about. So Flying Camelot, Culture and Technology, the F-15 and F-16. Before we get really into the details of how these two aircraft, the F-15 and F-16, were made and designed and what was kind of influencing them, I want to explain why I even came up with this project, why I wanted to write a book about this, and explain kind of what I mean with this nostalgia idea that I was kind of getting at. So when I was working on my PhD, I knew, I loved airplanes. I had written about the F-4 Phantom in my master's program, and I wanted to take that study forward and look at the design of kind of the next generation of aircraft. So I knew I wanted to write about the F-15 and F-16 just because I was interested in them. And I started reading all these memoirs and interviews with pilots and engineers who had worked on these airplanes or flown these aircraft. And several things just kept popping up. And one of the things that kept popping up over and over again was this kind of nostalgia for World War I, or at least a nostalgia for the idea of World War I. Obviously, most of the people involved in the F-16 were not old enough to have been alive during World War I. Some of them maybe were little kids. But they talked about World War I like it was this, like the good old glory days, of air-to-air combat. And it's just an idea that kept coming up. So I wanted to look at how this kind of memory of previous wars, especially World War I, was kind of influencing these folks as they went about designing new aircraft. And this was an idea that kind of had come up to me. Of all things, I was studying ancient history at the time. I was really into, the Roman Republic and the Greeks and all this. And I had come across this book, Soldiers and Ghosts, which is a really interesting book about how the Romans kind of idealized the Greeks and tried to kind of recreate their methods of warfare, or at least what they thought their methods of warfare would have been, and that the Greeks were kind of doing the same to the Homeric era. And so this book kind of made this argument about how, there's this nostalgia for the past that kind of influences how people approach warfare, and that can sometimes be negative, can sometimes be positive as well. But I thought that idea was really interesting, and I kind of saw a similar dynamic playing out. So that's kind of what I wanted to unpack and see how much of that is really going on and how much of it is something else. So that led me to this kind of study of World War I's fighter pilot culture, the fighter pilot mentality, and how that culture kind of evolved into the days of the F-15 and F-16. And you get this right down to the first flight of what was the prototype of the F-16, the YF-16. This is Phil Ostricher here on the screen, and he was the first person to fly the prototype, the YF-16. And he called the prototype the Camelot of aeronautical engineering. And I thought that was really powerful language that evoked this kind of Knights of the Air mentality that you see going back all the way to World War I, right, with someone like Eddie Rickenbacker. And there was another test pilot who actually took to wearing a World War I helmet on the test flights of the F-16 because he thought it was such a direct connection to that type of airplane. They called this the pure air-to-air fighter, and they called it a pure airplane that wasn't, in their minds, messed up with some other high technology approaches that got in the way. They really felt like they were reconnecting with some sort of World War I style aircraft. So how do we get there? So let's talk about what I mean when I say fighter pilot culture. That's kind of a loaded term. And as I unpack it, I want you to understand, whenever you talk about culture this way, it's very broad. We're painting with broad strokes here. So I'm going to say a lot of things about kind of like stereotypical fighter pilots, but this does not apply to every single fighter pilot. There's a lot of pilots that really like this kind of culture. There's a lot of them that are kind of indifferent, and then there's some that kind of reject it. But I wanted to look at what are the trends that show up in fighter pilot culture? What are the kind of figures and characteristics that are held up as admirable? And culture also changes over time. So this is a little bit more true of kind of World War I era through the Vietnam and immediate post-Vietnam era than it is today. But I started looking through all these memoirs and interviews, and these are the 5 things that to me just kept popping out over and over again, whether it's in actual pilots talking about their experience or how those experiences are portrayed in pop culture. Like here I have some examples of movies and comics and TV shows that kind of celebrate this fighter pilot culture. And these are the 5 things that really just jumped out at me. You could not avoid these 5 things wherever I was reading about these pilots' experiences. So individualism, which could include this kind of skepticism about authority figures and sometimes resistance to authority figures. Aggressiveness is one that came up constantly. The idea that these, what makes a good fighter pilot is someone who, presses the attack, shows that aggressiveness in combat, and sometimes also can lead to competitiveness between pilots, usually in a friendly way, but sometimes in a less friendly way. Use of heroic and mythological imagery. What I mean by that is this whole idea of knights of the air. One thing that really jumps out when you look at the World War I generation is the continual comparisons to knights and King Arthur iconography and the idea of suits of armor and the airplane as a steed. It's easy for us now to look at these World War I aircraft. They're made out of wood and canvas, and it seems very low tech to us and very kind of old fashioned. But in 1915, those biplanes were like cutting edge, high technology, the most advanced things that existed. And a lot of these pilots really gravitated towards that. And they really enjoyed this kind of, they felt they were taking the traditions of the knighthood and transferring it to this new high technology environment. And you see that language being used, not just by the pilots themselves, but by the press, and also by people like H.G. Wells, the sci-fi writer, was very much into this culture. And he, even before the war started, he was arguing that anyone who gets an air-to-air victory should automatically be knighted. So there's this association with knighthood and aerial combat even before the war starts from these kind of popular fiction authors. So there's that. There's this advocacy for technology. Now, obviously, I just made this big point about technology, and anytime you're talking about aircraft and air forces, this is a technological conversation, right? The airplane is a piece of technology. But what I saw in a lot of these pilot interviews and memoirs is there were certain technologies they really liked and certain technologies they really didn't like. And it tended to be, if they felt a technology would help them achieve their air-to-air kind of mission, their aerial combat mission, that was something they would gravitate towards. And anything they felt like detracted from that is something that they were skeptical about. So the enhancing of fighter roles through technology was seen as good. And we'll unpack some of what I mean by that a little bit later. And then the last one is this kind of sense of a protectiveness about the fighter pilot community. Yes, a lot of these guys are early on, pre-1993, they're all guys, but they are very protective of their community. They are competitive with one another, maybe in a friendly way, but they see themselves as kind of a close-knit group of folks that are sometimes misunderstood by non-fighter pilots. There's some rivalries with other types of pilots. So there's kind of a community that's forming there. So these are the 5 characteristics. Again, I want to make it clear, not all fighter pilots adhere to all these characteristics or celebrate all of them. But for the most part, I think fighter pilot culture generally looks in a positive light on these 5 characteristics. And a lot of fighter pilots see these as things to strive for. Again, less true today than it might have used to have been, up through the 70s. But you still see some of this today in other ways. So this was kind of guiding the way I was looking at this. And you see this culture really form in World War I around this idea of the ace, which is brought about by the French press initially, and then very quickly spreads. The idea that, 5 aerial victories makes you an ace. And so the whole concept of counting your victories becomes very important. And this is a way for these pilots to have status with each other. And just the idea that aerial combat and air-to-air fighting is so key to these folks and seen as the height of what they're trying to achieve. And these are just a few examples. But like I said, a lot of these folks expressed it in very different ways. Somebody like Frank Luke, for example, who is very aggressive to the point of almost being reckless and putting himself at incredible risk quite often, is a very different type of fighter pilot than someone like Eddie Rickenbacker, who is also very aggressive, but is much more methodical and practiced and kind of detail oriented and very, tactical in that sense. But both are kind of living up to these kind of fighter pilot ideals in their own ways. So there's lots of different ways that pilots express this. So moving out of World War I, though, you see this shift start to happen in the 20s and especially in the 1930s, where the airplane is still kind of a new technology at this point. There's still a lot of confusion about how exactly do we use these machines. And in World War I, you can see, the most important use of aircraft is probably observation and target spotting for artillery, but that doesn't sell papers, right? So that doesn't get as famous or as romanticized. There's also, of course, there's bombing during World War I. There's interdiction of supply routes. There's strafing of enemy ground forces. So there's all the things that aircraft do. They're doing those mission sets in World War I, but it's that air-to-air combat one that gets famous and gets in the public's kind of mindset and gets that romanticization happening. And a lot of the pilots, play into that because they have the same feelings about it. But after the war's over, there's this kind of reevaluation of, okay, how are we going to use this technology of the airplane in the most effective way? And what happens in the US is this kind of focus on bombing. And you have what I'll call bomber dominance. And you have a group that starts to call themselves the Bomber Mafia, and they're kind of running the show at Maxwell, now Maxwell Air Force Base, which is kind of the training center for the Air Force, where they're coming up with the doctrine of strategic bombing. And the idea here is that the most effective way to use an airplane is to fly it right over the enemies on the ground. Don't worry about them. We're going to go bomb way behind the lines. We're going to bomb the factories. We're going to bomb the oil plants. We're going to bomb the ammunition depots. We're going to stop things at the source. And that, to a lot of these air power bomber advocates, that was more important to them in winning the war than, say, bombing tanks on the front line or strafing troops on the front line or something like that. Not that that wasn't important, but that this idea of strategic bombing was more important and was going to win the war. And you can see this battle playing out at Maxwell, where these instructors are teaching the kind of next generation of airmen that are coming up into how to do this. And the fighter cadre down there, kind of led by Claire Chennault, basically gets pushed out of the school, and these bomber guys like Lawrence Kuter and some others end up kind of running the show. And so this idea of bomber dominance in the Army Air Forces, Army Air Corps, then Army Air Forces, becomes the trend. There still are fighters. Fighters are still important, and they are still there, but they have been kind of, or at least they feel like they have been relegated to this kind of subculture. So that you see an increased amount of protectiveness. I think that there's some defensiveness in talking to some of the fighter pilots from this era about they feel a little bit marginalized because of the bomber dominance that's kind of running the show. And this is when you see, summed up in this alleged, I still have not found a perfect source for this, but Curtis LeMay allegedly is famous for saying, flying fighters is fun, flying bombers is important. And that kind of sums up the attitude in the Air Force during this period, certainly of World War II, but also the immediate post-World War II years. That's kind of running things here. The Korean War does see a shift back towards kind of celebration of fighter cultures. There's this kind of brief moment in the Korean War where the MiG-15 shows up, right? And you've got Chinese and North Korean and even Soviet pilots flying MiG-15s, and the Air Force has to roll out the F-86 Sabre as the counter to that. And you get these iconic air-to-air duels, like with some of the pilots pictured here, that are getting into these, kind of now legendary air-to-air battles that people look up to. And it seems for a moment like there's going to be this kind of revival of this fighter pilot culture, this romanticized idea of the noble knights in the air kind of thing. But the Air Force doesn't look incredibly favorably on what goes on in the Korean War, and they still hold firm after the Korean War is over. The Air Force, does their studies, and they figure that, well, strategic bombing is still the way to win wars, and we're still going to focus on that. And yes, this fighter thing is important, but it wasn't the most important thing. And so that's going on. And so after the Korean War, this is the situation. You've got a lot of fighter pilots that are feeling misunderstood or left out, or more importantly, they're feeling like they don't have real fighter aircraft after the F-86 getting the attention that they feel like they should deserve. So you start seeing a shift in the Vietnam War. And here's some examples of some of the celebrated fighter pilots from this war. Again, there is a lot of air-to-air combat happening, but it's kind of rare. If you had 100 pilots that have, Vietnam War experience in a room and ask if any of them ever fought with a MiG, it's probably a low number, if any, that would raise their hand. But there is some air-to-air fighting going on. There's about 200 air-to-air victories that the U.S. Gets against various MiGs. There's MiG-17s and MiG-21s and a few MiG-19s as well. But what's happening in these fights is that they're going a little bit differently. And this is for a number of reasons. So there's a number of changes happening during and immediately after the Vietnam War that kind of get the Air Force in particular, and this is a little bit true for the Navy as well, but it's certainly very true for the Air Force, that they're reevaluating their approach to air-to-air combat. And they feel like something's going wrong here, and they need to kind of recapture something that they feel may have been lost. And I want to point out what a couple of those things are. So the first is this perception of poor air-to-air performance. You'll see various statistics of kill ratios being thrown out. I don't know if the kill ratio is the most important thing, but there's certainly this sense that the aircraft that are used in Vietnam, like the F-4 Phantom, is the most important frontline fighter, but also the F-105. The A-4 is doing a little bit of air-to-air fighting as well. There's some F-100s that get a few encounters, but mostly F-4s and F-105s are not performing as well as the U.S. would like against these MiG fighters. The kill ratios are lower than they expect, but also just kind of in general, it seems like the Phantom's not doing as well in air-to-air combat as everybody wants. And there's this sense that the MiGs, which are smaller, if you put a MiG and a Phantom right next to each other, the MiG's about half the size, or slightly more than half the size. So there's the sense that, the Phantom's not really designed for air-to-air combat. That's not its primary mission. It can do it, but it's not optimized for that. There's other things as well, like training. There was a lot less air-to-air combat training, and some people coming into Vietnam had none. Some of them, and the few that did have some air-to-air training had very little, and it was very standardized. And so there was this sense, like Robin Olds especially famously like chewed out a new group of pilots that showed up under his command in 1967 when he was a commander of the 8th Tactical Fighter Wing, claiming that none of them were actual fighter pilots, even though they were all fighter pilots, but he didn't feel like they had been trained well enough to actually do dogfighting. So there's a sense that the technology, the airplane isn't there, the training isn't there, the airframes aren't there. And part of this is because a lot of engineers and a lot of war planners felt like, this era of dogfighting is over. We have missiles now, right? So air-to-air missiles started to be developed, and by the mid to late 50s, they're actually being used. By the time you get into the 60s and 70s, there's this, we're going to use missiles for everything. So the idea is we don't need to get in dogfights. We don't need to do this turn and burn stuff. We can fire a missile. The missile will track. The airplane doesn't have to do all the maneuvering. The missile can do the maneuvering. And the technology just wasn't quite working. The missile hit rates in Vietnam were not great. And that's for a lot of reasons, partially because the rules of engagement in Vietnam required a visual ID of the enemy aircraft. So this was to avoid, friendly fire, of course, but it meant that none of these missiles were being fired in the performance envelope that they were designed for. So they were designed to be fairly long range missiles, and they were all being fired at very short ranges. So they were also missing. There were also a lot of problems. The technology didn't work. A lot of times seekers didn't guide. A lot of times the motors didn't work. Some of that was due to the environmental conditions in Vietnam. Some of that was due to maintenance practices. There's all kinds of things contributing to this. But in any case, things are not going as well in air-to-air combat as the Air Force wants. So that's one. Another big change that's happening in the end of the Vietnam War and coming out of the Vietnam War is this change in leadership in the Air Force. So if, think about it, it makes sense, right? Coming out of World War II, so many people that participated in World War II and were going to be, promoted up the ladder is mostly former bomber crews, former bomber pilots, former bomber crew members. There's just so many more of them. So moving into Korea and Vietnam, those wars saw so many more tactical aircraft being used. Even in bomber roles, a lot of times it was fighter and attack planes doing the ground attack and doing some of those bomber missions. So there's just a lot more pilots had fighter experience coming out of Korea and Vietnam, and so they are the ones getting promoted. And so by the time you get into the late 60s, into the early 70s, the whole leadership cadre of the Air Force has basically shifted from mostly bomber pilots to mostly fighter pilots. And that's not to mean that any of these generals are parochial and they only care about fighters or bombers or whatever. Most people that make it to that high rank are capable of thinking broader. That's why they get into that rank, because they have the ability to kind of look at the bigger picture and make these kind of higher level decisions. But it is kind of telling, right, that most of the leadership is former fighter pilots, and certainly that community is going to feel like it has more of a voice, and you start seeing that change. The other things that happen, and this is getting into a little bit after the Vietnam War into the 70s and 80s, which is they start to address these problems. Training gets changed. You see in 1969 the creation of the Top Gun school, the Navy Fighter Weapons Program. The Air Force creates a similar program in 1975. It's not as famous. I wish it were more famous, but it's called Red Flag. It's very similar to Top Gun, but it's the Air Force thing. New technologies, new aircraft. We're about to talk about those two aircraft that I want to focus on, but you also see things like the AWACS, the airborne radar that can track enemy targets in the air and friendly targets, or not targets, but friendly aircraft, and kind of keep track of these air-to-air battles. We also see these kind of more insider developments. I put the Corona ACE program on here. This is really interesting. This was in the mid-70s. The Air Force felt like they had become so deficient in air-to-air combat that they started an oral history program, and they assigned all these folks, basically their mission was find as many living aces from World War II as you can, maybe some Korea, and interview them and see if you can come to any conclusions about the type of personality that leads to someone becoming an ace pilot. And I think that's interesting. One, just the fact that they did it, but also the fact that there was this assumption that personality traits make you an ace or could lead to you becoming an ace. I think that was an interesting mindset that reveals. And so those programs are ongoing at the same time as these new aircraft programs. So let's get into how do we get from there to the F-15? And then it starts with these, what I'm going to call the fighter advocates. So we'll start with Chuck Myers. He's not alone in this. So 1964 is really when you can really put a date on when did they start thinking about the F-15 or what's going to become the F-15. Chuck Myers is a former test pilot. He's working for Lockheed at this point. He's later going to work in OSD, in the Secretary of Defense office. But he firmly believes that the Air Force at this point, and this point being 1964, does not really have any actual fighter airplanes. He kind of thinks that, the F-104, the Starfighter, is kind of a good fighter, but that's pretty much it. He thinks that, all these new fighters, the F-101 Voodoo, the F-102, the F-106, the F-4 Phantom, the F-105, the Thunder Chief, he's like, these are not fighters. They all might have F in front of their name, but they're not, in his mind, true fighters because they're not optimized for that air-to-air mission. They're not optimized for maneuvering in a dogfight. These are airplanes, they called them the Century series. And in his mind, he's like, these are designed to go in a straight line. They're interceptors. They're supposed to shoot down an enemy Soviet bomber, or maybe in a case like the F-105, it's, that's main mission is dropping a nuke, right? Go deliver a nuclear bomb. So he's looking at all these aircraft and being like, none of these are great dogfighters. They're not really true fighters. What we need is like a true air-to-air fighter airplane. And so he's advocating for that. He's contacting whoever he can within the Air Force, within the Navy, within NASA, trying to tell them like, we need fighters. And he's not alone in this. There's a lot of folks that agree with him, and they are getting into these positions of leadership. Arthur Agin is one of the most outspoken of these. So he starts putting together some panels to study this. He gets a bunch of former aces, Korean War era fighter pilots to talk about how the Air Force is deficient in this area, and they're going to study this issue. So they start pressuring the Air Force to be like, hey, we need some fighters. We need something that's dedicated to this role. And you start seeing that. There's another big shift that happens. And this is, I'm going to point to three things here. The first is, well, I guess the first is 1965, you start seeing air-to-air combat going poorly for the US in Vietnam. This is when the first losses to these MiGs, MiG-17s and MiG-21s, starts to happen. And so these fighter advocates are pointing to that saying, look, we're getting shot down by North Vietnamese MiGs. Why is this happening? We're supposed to have the best Air Force ever. We're supposed to have the most technologically advanced Air Force. And yet we are losing to these kind of older, less sophisticated aircraft. Why is this happening? So right around the same time that that's happening, you have this air show in 1967 where the Soviets reveal some new airplanes, the Su-15 and the MiG-25. The MiG-25, really, there's no other way to say it. It just scares the hell out of the Air Force. I mean, they look at this airplane and there's a few things they don't realize about it. Like they don't realize that, yes, it can go Mach 3, but if you do that, it blows the engine up. So they don't know that part. They just think of it as this is a super high speed airplane. They think that it's going to be a great dogfighter, and they're worried that the Air Force is worried that they don't have anything that can counter this threat. So they're like, we need to develop a new airplane as quickly as possible that can deal with these emerging threats. Mostly the MiG-25, but also the Su-15 looks pretty formidable. There's also, as the Air Force is considering, some new aircraft, it's also prescient enough to realize it takes a long time to develop an aircraft, and we need something in the interim that we can buy and send to Vietnam that we can procure in large numbers. It wants not a new aircraft, it wants to buy something off the shelf that it can buy in large numbers. And there's a huge debate about, should we buy F-5s, the Northrop F-5, or should we buy these A-7s? The A-7 is better at ground attack, F-5 is better at air-to-air roles, and that's kind of the lens through which they're viewing this. The Air Force decides to buy the A-7, which then, because it's more of a ground attack focused plane, then frees up these fighter advocates to say, okay, you didn't pick the F-5, so we are especially deficient in this air-to-air role. We need whatever new plane we develop needs to be focused on air-to-air, and that's exactly what sort of happens. So in 1965 is when the Air Force authorizes this FX program, the Fighter Experimental. And you immediately, just like in any big bureaucracy, you immediately get these kind of camps forming of people advocating for different things. So you've got these fighter advocates like Agin and Myers, and there's a group associated with them that really want a very lightweight fighter. We want it to be designed almost solely for air-to-air. We want it to be designed for maneuverability. Agility is the thing they want more than anything else. And they're trying to convince the Air Force, you guys have always chased after speed. You've said that speed is the most important characteristic, but we actually don't need to go super fast. We just need to be able to maneuver at the speeds at which dogfights happen, which is usually right around Mach 1. Like, we don't need a fighter to go Mach 3. We need a fighter that can maneuver really well right around Mach 1, give or take a few hundred miles an hour. And so the air staff and some elements in Tactical Air Command, depending on who you ask, and some elements within the Secretary of Defense office, again, depending on who you ask, there's some voices saying, yes, that's good, air-to-air is good, but we need this plane to do all kinds of missions. We want it to do more stuff. We want it to be able to attack ground targets as well. We want it to be able to do interdiction. It needs to have multi-role capability, which is a fair point. But what happens is what's called requirements creep. Now, some of you are probably familiar with the idea of mission creep, right? Where you go into somewhere to do a mission, and it's like, oh, can you also do this one other thing? And it's not a really big deal. Can you just add this one little small mission onto that and add this other small mission onto that? And before you know it, your entire mission is completely different. This is exactly what's happening with the FX. It starts off as this kind of air-to-air focus, and then someone comes in and says, yeah, but I want it to go Mach 2.5. And yeah, but I want it to have a burst capability. Yeah, but I needs to have a swing wing. And yeah, but it also needs to have ground attack capability. It needs to carry this type of bomb. It needs to carry that type of bomb. And so pretty soon, by the time you add all these up, right, if you've got a faster airplane, more of it needs to be built out of titanium, which means it's heavier. If you want to increase the range, you got to add more fuel, which means it's heavier, which means you need a bigger wing, and so you start adding all these requirements up, and pretty soon they realized that they had built just the F-111 again. They realized that whatever fighter they were asking for is going to look very similar to the F-111. They started referring to it as the baby TFX, the TFX being a tactical fighter experimental, which became the F-111. And they said, this is not actually what we want. All these requirements getting in the way. What we need is someone new to come in and look at this. So they turned to a man named John Boyd. So let's talk about John Boyd for a second. If you haven't heard of John Boyd, he is a very controversial figure in Air Force history. He's a little bit of a lightning rod. There are people who really love John Boyd, and they see him as, one of the greatest strategic and tactical and operational minds of our time. And there are other people who think he's overrated and does not make any important contributions at all and should just be ignored. And then there's what I'm trying to do is kind of come in between those and say, like, let's understand him in this context and understand him kind of more as a person and figure out, why he has this kind of following, why people do love him so much, but also what does he actually contribute to this? He contributes quite a lot, but maybe not as much as the people who say he's the second coming of Clausewitz, but he does contribute quite a lot that's important. And the biggest thing he does is this idea of energy maneuverability. This is an idea he developed while he was a student at Georgia Tech, engineering student. And this idea is he's taking equations, just to make it as simple as my brain can understand, he's taking equations from thermodynamics and applying them to aircraft maneuverability. And he's saying that, like, instead of just thinking about it as turn radius or wing loading, think about this as gaining energy versus losing energy when you turn or when you slow down or when you speed up. So he had all these charts where he could chart out at what areas and like at what turn rates or at what speeds or what altitudes or at what G-force a particular airplane would have an energy advantage, which means it would be more maneuverable than another airplane. And he would put these, so he would create these two energy charts and color code them to show, green, as you can see here. This is a chart that the Air Force Academy uses to teach. So he would say, at this, in these certain scenarios on this graph, the F4 can outperform a MiG-21, and at these red points is where the MiG-21 has an advantage. So he was creating all these charts, and this was incredibly important. This method of evaluating and understanding what fighter aircraft were doing and were capable of was a really important way to look at this. It's still used today in design and in evaluation and in teaching tactics and things like that. So Boyd gets assigned to the FX program in the fall of '66. And his bosses come in, they're like, hey, we really need you to take a look at this. John Boyd, he had kind of these bona fides, if you will. He had been a F-86 pilot in the Korean War, but only at the tail end of it. He only had, I think, 29 combat missions, so very small combat record. He was able to damage a MiG-15 in a fight once, but he does not have any aerial victories to his name. He went on to become an instructor at the Air Force Fighter Weapons School at Nellis, and there he kind of earned this reputation for being a very good fighter pilot and being able to, often, he claims to be undefeated in these kind of simulated mock combat exercises. That is a very highly debated claim, and I'll just leave it there. But needless to say, he got a reputation, even if it's a debated one, for being a very good fighter pilot while he was an instructor. He has a lot of friends that are helping him work on this energy maneuverability project. And so he gets assigned to the FX program. Something that he's doing that's interesting, I don't have a slide for this, I want to go a little off topic here, because part of Boyd's personality and part of what makes him, in my opinion, the kind of ultimate example of this fighter pilot culture, right? John Boyd is all 5 of those characteristics taken to the max, right? So he likes to kind of ignore authority and kind of ignore the rules when he feels like he doesn't want to follow the rules. So he has a friend working at Eglin Air Force Base where there's a computer analysis shop. This is Tom Christie. And he will send Tom Christie data, and they will like go in and use it's not like today where you have personal computers. Back then they had this big IBM machine that filled the whole room, and getting time to use the computer was really difficult because computer time is very highly managed and the Air Force needed it for certain programs. And so you had to budget your computer time to certain programs, and it was tightly controlled. So Christie was able to go in and charge John Boyd's energy maneuverability calculations. He would have the computers running them, and he would charge it to different programs fraudulently. And they were basically stealing computer time, which was a big no-no. But that's how they did a lot of this early analysis and how they developed their energy maneuverability charts and things like that. They also used that to develop this program called TAC Avenger, which was a computer simulation program that could take 2 aircraft that would have, characteristics as Boyd defined them through his energy maneuverability equations. And then they would run like hundreds of simulated dogfights against these 2 aircraft. And it would tell you who had a percentage chance of winning in various scenarios. And so they were using that to look at, various designs, could this version of the FX beat a MiG-21, what percentage of the time, things like that. So they were running all these programs, and what you get is this kind of F-15 emerging. So you have requirements get stripped down a little bit. So Boyd is really pushing for this air-to-air focus. I want this airplane smaller. I want it to be based solely around the idea of maneuvering. I want it to have the smallest radar possible. He wants to get rid of anything that's in the way of what he feels is most important, which is maneuverability. So he's trying to get it small. And what ends up happening is you get these requirements that I've listed here: the Mach 2.5, a low bypass engine, low wing loading, as light as possible, 40,000 pounds. He wants to be focused on air-to-air. There is a push. Obviously, there's other elements pushing for more of a multi-role focus. They want to be a little faster, a little bit longer range. They want to have air-to-ground capability. They finally get the Chief of Staff of the Air Force to buy into this concept of air-to-ground only. I only want air-to-air only. I do not want any air-to-ground. This whole not a pound for air-to-ground attitude starts to finally take hold. But it's a battle, right? There's many times where McConnell, the Chief of Staff, has to step into other generals and other people from other agencies asking like, well, can it do this and can it do that? And he's like, no, air-to-air only. And he keeps pushing this idea. Finally, to the point where he's testifying to Congress in the late 60s. And Congress asked Chief of Staff McConnell point blank, will the F-15 have any air-to-ground capability at all? And he says, over my dead body. And this might be a little bit in bad taste, but he does die in 1986. And it's also in 1986 where the F-15E Strike Eagle that is designed for air-to-ground capability has its first flight. So he sort of gets his wish. But of course, Eagles have gone on to be very effective in air-to-ground roles as well. So you get this string of requirements here. There's 3 companies that bid on this: McDonnell, Fairchild Hiller, and Rockwell, North American. McDonnell ends up, spoiler alert, McDonnell wins this contract and goes on to develop what we now know as the F-15. But it's important to note that Boyd and his friends, so he has Pierre Spray is an analyst with OSD. That's one of Boyd's best friend. I mentioned Tom Christie. Myers is also involved with this group. They are really unhappy with the F-15. Myers goes as far as to say this. He says, I wouldn't want people to think I helped spawn that airplane. He says, I want it to have been smaller and better, and that drove us to try again. So this group wants to try again and make an airplane from scratch. So this F-15 is an example of Boyd kind of taking an existing project and trying to, strip it down to what he wants. He's like, why don't we start from scratch, from the ground up, with something I would want to design? And that leads to the FXX, sometimes called the FX2. And this is more extreme, lighter, 20,000 pounds. Make it more maneuverable. Remove as much of the technology, as much of the avionics as you can. Spray goes as far as to say this, I've censored it, but that's fighter pilot lingo for get anything out of that airplane that's not involved in air-to-air killing. We want it gone, to the point of they don't want a radar in the front. And for those of you who don't know, I'm assuming most of you know, but just in case, the nose cone of a plane, most military planes anyway, certainly a fighter plane, has a radar dish inside, and that allows the pilot to track and lock on to enemy targets. But the bigger your dish, the larger your fuselage has to be, and the longer range dish you have requires a bigger airplane. These guys, Boyd and Spray and these folks, they don't want any radar dish at all. Their idea is, a pilot can use his eyes. We don't need to have this radar capability. That's forcing our airplane to be too big and too heavy. Strip it out. So they want it to be as lightweight as possible, which is like a daytime only, clear skies kind of fighter, which, some people are looking at this and they're saying, you're talking about using an aircraft that with no radar, can't fly at night, can't see through clouds, and you're talking about using it in Western Europe, a area not known for clear skies most of the time. So there's some skepticism about this project. But nonetheless, they're doing it. And the way that they're going about this is another example of kind of Boyd getting around the rules, right? He doesn't want this to be preempted. He doesn't want this project to be taken away from him. So he's meeting secretly with Harry Hilliker, who's an engineer at General Dynamics in Fort Worth, Texas. And so they want to have these secret meetings where they're going to work on this project. So Hilliker would literally, he would fly up from Fort Worth to DC on Friday nights. He would get a hotel. Him and Boyd and Spray and three of them would hang out at this hotel, and they would work on these designs for this airplane all weekend. He would fly back Monday morning and go back to work. It was all that they would talk about it in secret code. They would call it the Lord's work, and they didn't want people knowing about it, which is nowadays completely illegal. And they've admitted this. They've said, what we did, is by today's standards, would have gotten us indicted. But they're working with a contractor to design an airplane without doing any sort of source selection process or competitive process to get other contractors involved. And it's all being done under the table. So they're developing these designs. And this group starts to call itself the Fighter Mafia. So you've got Boyd, Spray, I mentioned Tom Christie. Everest Riccioni is another analyst that comes in who's working at the Pentagon, and he becomes very good friends with Boyd and this whole group, and he's kind of leading this. And I mentioned the secret meetings. And they really see themselves as this kind of guerrilla movement. That's their word that they describe themselves as, where they see themselves as fighting against the Pentagon in a strange way. That's the way they talk about it, that they are trying to achieve this goal of getting a new airplane kind of under the radar here. There are others that share this goal. It's not like they're doing this by themselves, but it's interesting because they are so outspoken and aggressive with how they're pushing this, that other people that have the same goal are kind of running around doing damage control. So you have this is an example of some folks like Glenn Kent, Otto Glasser, Larry Welch. They also share this goal. They want the same thing. They want a small, lightweight fighter plane, but they think that Riccioni and Boyd and these guys are being so loudmouthed about it and so outspoken and so mean and aggressive towards anyone who disagrees with them, that it's actually doing their cause more harm than good. And so you've got Kent running around kind of behind the scenes, talking to Meyer and saying like, hey, I know Riccioni said that, but they don't really mean that, and what they're saying is important. And so he's trying to smooth over some of these relationships to kind of help move this thing along. This also is all happening at the same time where there's a move to get back to a prototype style of procurement. In the 60s, they had moved away from this. And there's this desire when David Packard came in as Deputy Secretary of Defense to let's start doing more prototyping because we haven't done that in a long time. He thought it would be a way to save money. Getting away from prototyping had been seen as a way to save money, but it didn't end up working out very well. And so it leads Packard to say yes to a lightweight fighter program as a candidate for trying out his new prototyping process to see if that will be a feasible way to do aircraft procurement in the future. But the idea is that these are going to be technology demonstrators. So they say, okay, we want you to build some prototypes of lightweight fighters, not because we're going to buy one, but because we just want to have these prototypes so that we can test out various technologies on them, different systems, maybe their weapon systems, maybe their avionic systems, control systems, whatever. So Boyd ends up writing the requirements for this, and you get all these contractor responses to trying to develop a lightweight fighter. I realize I'm want to be sensitive on time, so I'll move through this a little quickly. You can see here all the different designs that are submitted as part of this, and the source selection on this is really interesting, but who ends up winning is Northrop and General Dynamics. And so you get these two lightweight fighter prototypes. I mean, two of each, so four. But there's the YF-16, which has fly-by-wire controls. Fly-by-wire means there is a computer that is interpreting the input of the pilot, and then the computer tells what flight surfaces to move, rather than if you move the stick this way, it pulls a cable that hydraulically assistedly moves a flight surface. So there's this extra step, which makes the plane more maneuverable. The fly-by-wire is designed to make it easier for the pilot to control the airplane, and makes it can turn harder and sharper and accelerate faster and things like that with fly-by-wire controls. It's got a single engine, slightly lighter, it's cheaper. The pilot seat is reclined that's so that more G forces can be taken by the pilot. So the YF-16 can pull up to 9 Gs before, and the pilot can take it. The YF-17 has traditional controls. It's double engine. It's a little bit heavier, but it also has a lot more power. So there's a little bit of trade-off between these two. And there's testing again. Again, they're supposed to be technology demonstrators, but halfway through this process of flight testing, the new Secretary of Defense comes in and says, hey, it's no longer a technology demonstrator. We're going to buy one of these airplanes in large numbers. And that's now, you didn't plan for this, but it's now competitive fly-off. And that really changes how the test program is working, and it moves things along. So you might recognize, for those of you with sharp eyes, if you're thinking that the YF-17 looks very familiar, it's because the Navy ended up modifying the YF-17 into what later becomes the FA-18 Hornet. So if it looks kind of like a Hornet to you, it's because it very much is the basis for what becomes the Hornet later on. But the YF-16 ends up winning this fly-off competition, and immediately there's a shift to go, okay, now we have the prototype, but how do we make that into an operational airplane that we can use in the field? And the first thing the Air Force does is we're going to make it multi-role. We're going to add a big radar onto the front. We're going to add a bunch of avionics to it. We're going to make it bigger. We're going to make it carry a bunch of bombs. And all of this is against what Boyd wanted, and all the fighter mafia folks wanted. So they are howling with anger at this. I'm going to skip ahead to some of these quotes. So there's this idea. I love this cartoon that kind of displays, like, this is the argument of Boyd and the fighter mafia. General Dynamics published this cartoon. They were trying to counter this idea. That's why they called it the myth. They were trying to say, no, the prototype and production are not very different. But this is the idea. Then Boyd is talking about how it's diminished its maneuvering capability. His assistant calls it a disastrous compromise. Christie says it's unacceptable. Myers has the harshest critique, and this is just one quote, but there's a whole 2-page memo where Myers just basically yells this and says that the production model of the F-16 is a mutilation of character, and this is a travesty, and all this. So it's seen as such a disaster that this is a big part of what moves Boyd to eventually retire and become more politically active in the reform movement. I'm realizing I'm running out of time, and I want to get to your questions, so I want to just sum up a couple of things here. We can go into some questions about what I just skipped over if you want. But this idea that culture influencing technological development, that's really what I wanted to get at, is this idea of this nostalgia for World War I influencing the technology decisions that we're making. Boyd and the fighter mafia are important. Their energy maneuverability concept is incredibly important. I also want to emphasize that they have a lot of help. It's not Boyd acting by himself. There's a lot of other folks involved in this process, both above and below and to the side of where Boyd is working. But this idea of it's speaking to the anxiety of the late 70s, I think Boyd gets a big following because he's able to kind of look at the military and say, like, he doesn't like how procurement is happening. And it's coming at a time where the Vietnam War is just ending. There's a lot of folks that are frustrated with how the Vietnam War went, both in and out of the military. And Boyd's message sounded very enticing to a lot of folks. And so he ends up becoming very popular and getting quite a bit of following. They do succeed in making these defense debates a little bit more public, which I didn't talk about the reform movement a little bit, but that's where Boyd and this fighter mafia group expands, gets really involved up on the Hill, and also involved in kind of the public media, public press, about taking these debates about how the defense industry works a little bit more public. And just finally, the idea that this legacy of everything they're doing and how this procurement works, how this technology works, is still very much active in the US. And that, we should consider these things, when we're designing new airplanes. Just, our culture and our belief systems and what we want our technology to do is very much influenced by our culture, and whatever culture we might come from individually or as a group. And that's something that should factor into how we talk about them, I think, especially as we get into a similar moment, right? If Boyd is speaking to a post-Vietnam audience that has a lot of anxiety about military capabilities, there's a very similar discussion happening right now as the Afghanistan war has drawn to a close, about how military technology should work moving forward. So I hope I've left enough time for questions. I would love to take them. Thank you so much. I will hand it back over.
Well, it's always interesting, when you think of the military, it doesn't matter what branch, you think there's just one mindset and everybody's on board. So it's always interesting to hear how there's not that one mindset, how there's all these different factions. And that Myers quote at the end, that was that was something.
Yeah, he was not happy.
We do have plenty of time for questions, and we did get quite a few questions as you were going through your presentation, Dr. Hankins, so I'll just bring those up right now. Oh, and I probably need to share my screen first before I do any of that. There we go. The first question, is what was the most surprising element of your research as you were going through all this? What really came across to you and just really struck you as something you really didn't expect to see?
Yeah, I will tell you, I'll be very honest. Maybe I should say this, but the most surprising element was when I started looking at all the emails a lot of these folks were having with each other. And this is in the 90s, when they're kind of giving interviews about a lot of this stuff. I came across a whole treasure trove of email correspondence that included, Boyd had already passed away, but several of his friends emailing with other people in the Air Force and other researchers. And it was just very, I guess like you were saying, I expect a certain kind of sense of officialness about these communications, but it was very kind of bitter and a lot of gossip and a lot of like, well, you'd see somebody would insult somebody and then they would forward that email to them, be like, well, so-and-so told me this, and they're like, so-and-so saying, and it was just a lot of that kind of dynamic happening with these emails. And I picked up on how you got a lot of big personalities in the room when these discussions are happening. That came across in all these emails. So just seeing how human these people were and how they got caught up in these arguments, I think was surprising and revealing, and I liked it.
Oh, nice. That is certainly not the answer I was expecting.
Yeah.
Next question. Why do you think that you were talking about in the beginning how they had this strong connection to seeing themselves as knights and chivalrous? And why do you think that they really thought of themselves like this and connected them, and the combat pilots connected themselves so strongly with the knights of old? Where was where was that sense of connection at, you think?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think it must come from the thing that I saw a few times is them talking about their boyhood, right? So you've got these guys, they're starting in World War One, they're 18, 19, 20 years old, maybe some of them, you know, because you had to be an officer to fly. So probably more like early 20s, mid 20s. A lot of them talked about growing up as kids, reading King Arthur stories. You know, think about what year this is. If you're 20 years old in 1915, you know, you were born in the 1890s probably. So a lot of them kind of grew up with these kind of legendary stories. Like those were, you know, I read comic books as a kid about superheroes. They were reading King Arthur legends. And I think that just culturally had a strong rooted presence for a lot of them. And they saw that connection to, you know, getting in a plane is like getting on a horse, and putting on my helmet is like putting on my armor. And they talked about it that way. I'm not just making that connection. They literally would make those analogies. But the other one I didn't say is that they also had a very strong connection to kind of Greek mythology. So there is, in that World War I generation, you'll see a lot of like, we're like the new Achilles, and we're like the new Zeus, if you were, or Hercules. And they kind of saw themselves in that kind of heroic mold as well. But I think the knights and Arthur iconography really lent itself to some good visuals. So that kind of took hold as well.
Sure.
These are great questions.
We have a great audience. How did the experience in the air over North Vietnam influence the designs of the F-15 and F-16?
Great question. The biggest thing, you can find these reports if you Google Red Baron reports. You can find some of them. Some of them are still classified, but some of them are available. And these are, the fact that they called them the Red Baron reports, another callback to World War I. But in the 70s, the Air Force did a big study of air-to-air combat in Vietnam with the sole purpose of trying to figure out how to get better at air-to-air combat. And they interviewed everyone they could find, as many as they could find, of anyone who had encountered a MiG. They would do a big oral history interview with them. There was a standard form. You can read all these accounts, and they're fascinating. And a lot of the lessons they took from that were the missiles aren't working. So we want something that has a gun. And that gets into, you know, the F-15, the F-16 have guns. The fighter mafia was really big on making the gun the centerpiece. They didn't think missiles would ever work. And if you pressed Pierre Spray on this, he would say, okay, I guess we could carry a Sidewinder, but I'm not going to actually shoot a guy down with the Sidewinder. I'm just going to force him to turn into me so that I can shoot him with a gun. And he thought that was the only application the missile would ever have. Of course, in the Gulf War, almost all the air-to-air kills are done with missiles, and a lot of them are done from beyond visual range. So that didn't really play out how they planned. But that Vietnam experience, so the missiles is one thing. Everybody noted, not everybody, but most pilots noted in Vietnam that their Phantoms and their, you know, Thunder Chiefs couldn't turn with the MiGs. And this was validated also by some secret, you know, at the time classified, again, it's been declassed, but studies of captured MiGs in the 60s revealed that the MiGs can turn better than the Phantoms. The Phantoms have advantages, but you need to be trained in how to use those advantages. Like taking the fight vertical, a Phantom has an advantage. But if you're doing a turning battle, the MiG has the advantage. And a lot of these reports turn that out. So when they went to the F-15 and 16, the idea was make these aircraft much more maneuverable in that turning capability. We want to be able to turn on a dime. We want to have that capability to be more agile. So those are the kind of the biggest two. There's other smaller things that play in as well. Training is a huge one we could have a whole other discussion about, but yeah, those are the big ones.
We are getting, I still have a couple questions on my PowerPoint, but we are getting some in just via the chat. Give me just a second. The Fairchild Republic, were they a subcontractor on either of the 15 or 16 programs?
Not that I know of. I'd have to go and double check and see if they did any of the smaller components or anything like that, but I don't think so. Okay. McDonnell was the primary, and they became McDonnell Douglas during the process, but they became the primary on the F-15, and obviously General Dynamics was the primary on the 16. But yeah, there was a lot of subcontractors. I'd have to go dig out who some of them were to get into individual subsystems. But yeah.
Next question. Did the conclusions of the Corona ACE program, did they kind of align with what you discovered as far as personality traits in your research?
That's a great question. I would say yes with an asterisk, because yes, a lot of the things I identified, like the aggressiveness and the community aspect and the kind of sense of individuality, those came across very strongly. But not all the time. I mean, again, it's not every pilot. Most of the pilots would say that, you need to be aggressive. You need to, we love having the sense of like, I'm in control, I'm in the cockpit, I'm the one making the decisions, that sense of individuality. But some pilots were not that way, but it was a minority that were not that way. What I thought was interesting about that program, though, and the reason that there's an asterisk, is the people asking the questions would ask very leading questions. So they wouldn't say like, what makes you a good fighter pilot? They would say, don't you think being really aggressive makes you a good fighter pilot? And of course, Tex Hill or whoever they're interviewing is going to be like, well, yes, I'm very aggressive. So like, I think there was a little bit of leading there, but even that is telling, right? It means that the questioners themselves made those assumptions about what makes a good fighter pilot. So I thought even that is an interesting data point. So
yeah. That's a good way to look at it for sure. In your opinion, where do you rate the F-15 and F-16 in terms of in the overall pantheon of American fighter planes?
Oh, that's such a hard question. I like these planes so much. That's why I wanted to read about them. I always say that my favorite fighter plane is the F-4. Even though I said a lot of negative things about it in this presentation, I have a soft place in my heart for it. But when you look at the record of these aircraft, right, the F-15 has something like, I don't remember the exact number, it's well over 100 air-to-air victories. It's never been shot down in combat. It's been shot down in simulated combat. F-16 has a great record as well. There are some losses of F-16s, obviously, but great. Both of these planes have amazing air-to-air and air-to-ground records. The F-16 has been incredibly effective and incredibly versatile in doing all kinds of missions. You can do just about anything with an F-16. It's great at air-to-air. It's great at air-to-ground. It's great in like a Wild Weasels mission, which is suppression of air defense. So what I think, if you take a step back and look at what's happening, I think the fighter mafia wanted to have these ultra specialized airplanes, right? They wanted just air-to-air focus, and something else could do air to ground. But I think these aircraft are kind of a move towards, you could have a multi-role airplane that really is effective and really is that jack of all trades in a lot of these roles. And I think the F-16 really proves that. Now they don't have stealth capability. Obviously that comes a little bit later, and that's a whole other project that we could talk about. Yeah.
I think it's just a couple more questions here, Dr. Hankins.
Sure.
What was NASA's role? What was NASA's role in the development of the F-16? I noticed you had some other contributors, besides the main contractor, and I was just curious about NASA's role.
Yeah, that's a great question. I have a friend that used to be the historian for the Air Force Research Laboratory, and he always gives me a hard time for not giving them enough credit. So AFRL, it wasn't called that then, but they had a big role in developing some of these technologies that went into the F-16. NASA played a role. I'm sure they had some role in the flight control systems development as well, but the biggest role I saw them playing is providing data in terms of like aerodynamics data on different designs, on different fuselage shapes, wing shapes, things like that. So Boyd would often get some just raw data about aerodynamic performance from NASA. So that played a role. I'm sure there was other small roles as well. There's quite a bit of crossover in personnel sometimes with that. So Yeah, that's a good idea that, somebody should, maybe I should, somebody should write a paper on the contribution of NASA to fighter aircraft. But that's the biggest ones that I saw when I was working on this.
And the last question we have, did the Air Force and the Navy go through these similar growing pains? Certainly I would imagine that they would have had to. But can you just kind of talk about the differences between both of these branches and the development of their aircraft during this period?
Absolutely. This is something that I get into a lot more in the book, and I didn't have time to get into it now, but this idea of the service rivalry between these two is really interesting, because the Navy's going through a lot of the same problems, right? They had a very similar Vietnam experience. And so they also want a new fighter aircraft, and they had developed their own program that was initially called the VFAX, which is the Fighter Attack Experimental, and then they changed to the VFX, and that program eventually produces the F-14 Tomcat. And so the F-15 and the F-14 are kind of in development at the same time, and the Navy's a little bit ahead of the Air Force. And so the Air Force is constantly worried that Congress is going to say, why do we need two airplanes? Let's just go with the Tomcat. And so the Air Force is constantly trying to say, no, the F-15 can do something that the Tomcat can't, and that's why we really need this. And there's even letters from Boyd where he talks about, like, I don't care what the Soviets are doing. I only care about what the Navy's doing and beating them. So it's kind of a fun rivalry that they're having. But both aircraft end up being very high performing aircraft in their specific roles. And there's a lot of similarities between them, but there's also some differences as well.
Well, Dr. Hankins, I look forward to reading your book. I have not had a chance to do that yet, but I certainly, especially after watching this presentation, it's going on my list, make no mistake. And I'd like to thank you for joining us today. We really appreciate it. And it was just a great presentation. I did a fantastic job. I've got a lot of good positive comments from our audience out there. And speaking of our audience, I'd like to thank everybody for joining us today for this program. And like I said, we do offer a slate of virtual programs beyond our book talks. Next one coming up tomorrow night with our trivia night. So we hope to see everybody come out for trivia, see how you can test your military knowledge against the education department over here at the Wisconsin Veterans Museum. We hope you have a great rest of the afternoon. Again, Dr. Hankins, thank you so much. We really appreciate your time today. And I hope everybody else has a great rest of the afternoon, and we'll see you next time.